I'm really excited about tonight because I am a longtime fan of both of David and Daniel's work. I want to say that in addition to Daniel's novel, which the movie is based on, which you can buy, you should buy his other novels, including Measuring the World, F, and Tyll, which are all fantastic. And in addition to the movies that John mentioned, for David, I just wanted to give a shout out to a couple of other favorites of mine, which are the War of the Worlds and The Paper, which is a movie I've been meaning to rewatch for a long time, and I hope this will inspire me to do it. Welcome both, and thanks for being here.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Daniel, thanks for staying up late or for getting up late or getting up early. I'm not sure how to put it, but thanks for coming in from Berlin. Daniel, you have written several books, and it occurs to me that, yes, we saw the trailer, which gives a lot of context, but just give people maybe just a quick preface of what the book is and what inspired you to write it and where you consider it in terms of your body of work.
I consider it, it was an idea I'd had for a long time, and it was always an idea for a very, very short book. And where I was stuck on a rather long novel, which then turned, which is now published, it's Tyll. And at some point, being stuck on that novel and having had the other idea, I was like, I really want to now write something where I really know where to go, how to do it, because I had planned to do it for such a long time. So I wrote it very fast on a break on that other long novel, and it was a lot of fun to write it. And the idea was it was actually an idea that came to me when my son was a baby, and I was so afraid of the baby monitor. Because that baby monitor with its infrared camera, the sleeping baby looks very scary. And I had this, and I was looking at this image of the strangely glowing image of the sleeping baby, and I was imagining if now suddenly I would see someone else in the room just standing there, and I would just die because it would be so frightening. And then of course I would look into the room, that's what I imagined, and no one would be there, but that person would be on the baby monitor. And so that was kind of the grain the whole thing grew from. And it's a novella, a found notebook novella. Like I wanted to do an equivalent to the thing called found footage movie, a found notebook novella, and it's a screenwriter, a writer of rather silly comedies. I wanted it to be something really completely different from the plot that's happening in the novella.
Yeah, he's writing a sequel to the movie Besties, which has made him a lot of money. He's writing Besties too.
And it's a really shallow, kind of funny, romantic comedy he's trying to write. And so he just starts writing down snippets and ideas for his romantic comedy on a family holiday. And then more and more he's recording the strange things happening around him, because the house they're in, which is not an old house, but a very new modern house, it just doesn't quite obey the rules of geometry and time. And also at the same time, his marriage is unraveling because he finds out that his wife has an affair with someone else. And those two things happen at the same time, the house behaving strange and his marriage coming apart. And then he's in the house because the wife leaves and he's alone with the young child, not quite a baby anymore, like a 3.5, 4-year-old daughter. And then he realizes he cannot leave the house anymore. And I felt I wanted to write a really scary, my publisher back then, he said to me, don't call it ghost story, call it metaphysical story. So I felt like the scariest situation I could possibly think of, like the next turn of the screw, to quote Henry James, like to make it more scary, would be to be in a house with a child, because when you're with a young child, you always have to pretend everything is fine.
Mhm.
And so I wanted to imagine the situation being alone with a young child in the most scary situation I could think of, but he has to pretend to the child everything's fine, and realizes he can't get out, and that's pretty much the story.
Yeah, and I had questions about the child angle of everything a bit later on, and so the book came out in 2017 here, and then David, how did you come to it, and talk a little bit about how you found the project and decided to take it on?
Okay, and then I have to remember to get back to the baby monitor, because I
Yes.
want to talk about that for a second. But so Kevin Bacon and I had made a movie together about 20 years ago called Stir of Echoes. That was a spooky movie, and we had a great time doing it, and it turned out well. And we'd stayed friends over the years and talked about had wanted to do something else together, but never quite found it. And we had just around that time, summer of 2017, started talking about, we'd sort of zeroed in on, hey, let's do something that's a scary movie, not a huge budget, and it's about a marriage, sort of a haunted marriage movie. We decided it was, and so we started kicking around ideas about those characters and laying out some things that might happen. And we were in the process of thinking about it and kicking it around. And Kevin called me one day because he'd read your review, John, of Daniel's book, and said, hey, there's a new book out. It sounds a lot like our movie. Why don't we read it? And I said, I don't want to read it. I want to do my story. I don't want to read this stupid book. So, you know, because you get very possessive of your things. So he read it and said, no, you really got to read the book. It's quite good, and it's a lot of what we're talking about. So I read it, and I thought it was great. And then suddenly I became, you know, I turned from resenting the presence of this book to incredibly grateful for the wonderful ideas in it. So Kevin and I called Daniel to see if the rights were available, if he was interested in you know, having us make it into a movie, and happily that all worked out.
You've adapted books before. Is it usually a fairly, you know, do you see pretty quickly what you want in something, and the fact that you want to take it on?
Yeah, it's kind of binary. You know, when you read a book with the idea of making it into a movie, your head kind of either immediately swims with, you can't go in expecting the book to have solved all the movie problems for you, because they're just not movies. They're, you know, they tend to take place inside people's heads. They're much more about what people are thinking and feeling. Movies, your tools are visual primarily, verbal some, you know. So when you read it, you're thinking, does your head swim with ideas? Does it have a premise that, you know, you think is exciting, and are there aspects of character that are really interesting to you? Everything else, you know, you can supply, but if the spirit of the book isn't right, if the premise isn't inventive, if the characters aren't any good, then you shouldn't get involved with it.
So let's talk about the baby monitor, and by way of talking about one other thing additionally, and this will be about keeping things in and taking things out from books when you adapt them. This is a short book. It's a very propulsive book. You can read it, I think, probably I'm a fast reader, but still, the amount of time I think you watch the movie, or less maybe. What the baby monitor scene is not in the movie, and I completely freaked out at that scene in the book.
It broke my heart. That's just personal. I couldn't. So in this last movie, in A Stir of Echoes, I have a scene with a baby monitor where they hear voices on the baby monitor. The little kid's upstairs, supposedly alone in the room. There's a whole sequence built around it, and I don't mind repeating myself, but I couldn't repeat myself quite that directly. So
Right.
the same with the writer character becomes a retired banker in our movie, in part because there's a bit more of a aura of guilt about him, and I wanted a profession that suggested, you know, that we kind of have our suspicions about.
You're saying your profession is not like that, David?
No.
There's no guilt.
Well, I didn't think the world needed a movie about a screenwriter. In a book, it's interesting. Also, a movie about a writer who, you know, may or may not be losing his grip on reality in a remote house has uncomfortable comparisons to, you know, one of the best horror films ever made. Yeah. So, you know, I don't need to set myself up to be compared with Kubrick.
I did think it was kind of funny that a novelist wrote a book about a screenwriter, and then the screenwriter took the screenwriter out.
The screenwriter immediately changed
Funny
it.
little do-si-do there. So Daniel, talk about how much, if at all, you collaborated in terms of bringing the book to the movies, and whether that's in terms of the story and the screenplay. I know you've had other things adapted, whether this was different in that regard than your past experiences with these things. And then I have a question about one particular part of this movie, but I'll start there with the general question.
It was different in terms that they really David and Kevin, and they didn't need me. They just needed the book. So we had a very pleasant conversation on the phone. And then it was like a Christmas, because like sudden unexpected Christmas, because suddenly then after all the bureaucratic lawyerly stuff about getting the contract done, it took so long. I'm used to the rather speedy process with European movies, and it takes. I'm sure it can take much longer, but it felt so long to me that I was like, I'm sure David has lost interest by now. So I'm sure he wants to write something else by now. This took forever. But then, like the day after I think it really was the day after the contract was signed. David sent me the script. He had written it.
I was sitting on that script for a month. The deal took forever, and I was berating the lawyers, saying, "You guys, I wrote the whole script in the time it's taking you to do the deal. What's the problem?" Yeah, it takes a long time.
So the one thing that I think it's funny, because after I watched the movie, I went back and reread the book, and I was actually surprised, because while watching the movie, I think I pictured it being more different from the book than it is. It keeps a lot of the sort of bones of it. But the one big difference, in addition to him being a banker, is that there's this, it's hinted at the trailer, but I don't want to give away too much, but there's a backstory to Kevin Bacon's character that isn't, at least it isn't fleshed out the same way if it's there in the book. And I wonder, David, I have my suspicions about why you added that, but just talk about, whether that was, whether you had other ideas for that possibly, or how naturally that came together and how you felt about it from the start.
I had a couple ideas of my own. I think with successful adaptations, you view yourself as value added. What can you bring of yourself to this, and what because you have to kind of make it your own, especially if you're going to direct it. You can't be slavishly faithful to a book, because they're very different, and also you're not inside that author's head, you're inside your own head. So there were two ideas that I was very interested in exploring. One was about a married couple that has a substantial difference in their age. Kevin is 27 years older than Amanda, and we see this a lot in Hollywood movies for ages. I think Grace Kelly was 21 and Gary Cooper was 54 when they made High Noon. And nobody said a word. They don't touch it. They leave it. Now, in recent years, there's been pushback on that, and thankfully it's changing a little bit. But I thought, to be a contrarian, what if we don't? What if we have them age inappropriate, but that's the text of the marriage? That's the problem. So from the first scene we see them, we say, we know there's something fatally flawed about this marriage, and that there's an unspoken tension. She's far too young for him. They're not talking about it, but it's an issue. So because I think in a successful, scary movie, haunted house type movie, I think you have to have a central relationship that's combustible and unexplored, and then you have to have a strange place where strange things happen to them. And if they both come together, and just as they did in the book, if the marriage is falling apart at the same time as this house is sort of taking them apart mentally. And then but I wanted to be able to connect the house more to his personal story. So he has a rather complex backstory, that there was his first wife died suspiciously 15 years ago. He was accused of killing her, tried rather publicly, and he was wealthy, and so it became a bit of a show trial. And and acquitted. Most of the public thinks he's guilty. He says he isn't. We're not sure what to think. And I thought I just thought that was interesting and gave him a complex backstory. And also, I'm always mindful, when you know the actor you're working with, it's impossible not, for me as a writer, it's impossible not to sort of write to them and write to what you think they will do really well. And what I love about Kevin is when he plays the good guy, it's always with shadings of darkness, and when he plays a bad guy, it's usually with shadings of comedy or lightness. He really goes back and forth on both sides of the line, so I wanted to be able to write a character that he could play that way.
Daniel, that brings to mind the issue of when you see people bring your characters to life. But this book does feel a little different because it's so internal, so psychological. You're sort of in and out of it quickly. It's mostly about the kind of psychological effect it has on people. So did you have a very firm vision in your mind of who this person was, and how did Kevin, match that or not match that, or change it in some way for you in your imagination?
Are you asking me or David?
I'm asking you as the author, who sees your characters come to life on the screen. What did you was there any chasm between him and what you had pictured in the book, or was it?
I did not really picture that the main character, because he was because the whole idea for me, it grew from this idea of a notebook and someone recording in real time what's happening to him, and that's why I had to make him a writer. Because who writes a notebook writing down everything that happens? Of course, a dentist could do that, but it would be kind of require some explanation. It requires much less explanation if you have a writer who's writing down ideas all the time anyway. And then I felt if I make him a writer, then it should be like the kind of writer that's most removed from any horror story, ghost story, metaphysical story possible, and also most removed from the kind of writer I am. And so I felt like, okay, then I make him a screenwriter of romantic comedies, and also someone who's writing a sequel to a successful romantic comedy, where I didn't even enjoy writing the first part, but hates writing the sequel. So I enjoyed. So I really enjoyed that, and then also it was important for me. The whole idea was formal, is what I'm trying to say. It was right. I loved this idea of putting in those snippets from screenplay he's writing, or the screenplay ideas he's writing down from, and in a way, when you read something like that, when you read someone writing down ideas for screenplay and then things happening, you feel like as a reader, those two things have something to do with each other. You try to find a mirror, the one side mirroring the other. And the whole point for me was they really have nothing to do with each other. He's trying to write a romantic comedy, and around him, horror is happening and completely, of course, takes over what he's writing. So in a way, I didn't really picture him because the whole idea was so internal. It was all seen from him as the guy recording it. And also, so it made sense to me to not give him a moral backstory. I felt like this is really something random happening to him. He's in the wrong house at the wrong time. But then, of course, it's not completely random because their marriage has been flawed from the very beginning. And in a way, all ghost stories do that. As David just said, there is a flaw, there's something wrong in our life, and the ghost reality, the ghosts, when we meet them, they kind of respond to what's wrong in our lives. And so it made a lot of sense to me that when you have a real person, and an actor is a real person, not just the.
Let's not go too far.
That you need more of that, that you need some kind of moral backstory. And the movie, I don't want to spoil the ending, but it brings it all around to a very elegant arc or circle towards the end.
Yeah.
So in a way, if they had tried to do the same thing I did in the formally in the book, I wouldn't even know how to do that, because it would have, the notebook idea wouldn't have worked. It would have been some kind of, I don't know, live real-time recordings on an iPad with some snippets from a romantic comedy. So it would have been a crazy experimental, strange art house movie that I don't think lots of people would have wanted to see. It's really form.
Well, I feel like you're also, you're saying that the character was so unlike you. You're implicitly telling us that you're never going to write a romantic comedy movie, which is a little disappointing, but that's fine.
Yeah, you're right. That's what I'm saying.
Both the movie and the book, dreams play a huge role in both the movie and the book. The character is beset by them in this house. And I wonder if either of you feels like there are pitfalls to writing about dreams or trying to film dreams, and how you, or whether it's exciting for you and you think it's a great tool. David, could you start with that one?
Well, they're enormously tempting because, you know, you want to write them and you want to film them because they can be full of great imagery. Strange things can happen that you don't have to worry about logically so much. But there's a great pitfall to them, which is that if the audience knows it's a dream, there are no stakes. You're just waiting for them to wake up. And so it becomes just a director pleasing himself. It's not, and who wants to watch that? The first time I remember dreams being artfully used and moving the plot forward is Spellbound, Hitchcock's movie, where the dream sequences were famously in part designed by Salvador Dali, and they were, as part of the subconscious exploration, they revealed what was torturing him, so they moved the plot the way the songs do in a very, very good musical. It didn't stop for the dreams. The story moved forward because of the dreams. So I wanted to have dreams where they move the story forward. So you have to delay the audience's realization that it's a dream as long as possible. And that can happen once, and then the audience's antennae are out and they know this movie has dreams, and they're trying to spot where they are occurring. So because I have more than one dream, I made the central problem of one of the dreams that the character knows it's a dream, and he's desperately trying many different things to wake himself up before the stakes take hold. So you can make it work that way. But they're really tempting, but they can be a trap, and they can kind of ruin your movie because they essentially have no weight.
But talk about the decision then to, not giving anything away, you start the movie with kind of a bang. I mean, the book sort of sets the scene, and they're going away to the house, and you kind of establish in your opening scene or scenes both the terror of the movie and also a lot of what you're talking about in terms of that theme of what is real and what's in people's imaginations or fears. Was that an easy decision to sort of start with your foot on the gas, or?
Yeah, it's interesting. That opening specifically, I wanted to accomplish a couple things. I wanted to say, I think it's important in a horror movie is to say in the beginning, terrible things can happen. So be on your toes. And then you can stop for about 45 minutes and play out a marital drama. And people have, hopefully the hook has been set. And you can now delay. I mean, the best recent example of it was Get Out, which has Jordan Peele's movie, which has a very simple but very scary opening. And then for 45 minutes is just the story of, this lady takes her boyfriend to meet her parents, and, some comedic racial humor ensues. That's it. But terrible stuff is coming because you've been told early on. And a movie only gets a chance to make its first impression once. And I also wanted to say there's a prominent shot of a mirror toward the end of it. And I wanted to say, think carefully. A lot of this is up here. So it's, I feel like I'm laying out a lot. The movie was done there were two drafts of the movie. One of the things I really love about the Blumhouse model is they say, okay, once we like your script and you promise that it'll be scary and we agree on this, tight budget, it's all yours. You can do whatever you want. We do ask that you leave some money aside for reshoots, because we've found that we like to look at the movie and talk about the next iteration of the movie. And I hadn't traditionally worked that way. I've done pickup shots here and there like everybody, but it was incredibly freeing because we had this tight shoot. We shot for 26 days, cut the movie together, looked at it, and then talked about what we thought worked, what didn't, what was done, what we wanted to further explore. And it was that second draft of the movie. Then we went and shot 4 more days. And it was that second draft of the movie, I think, where it really came together. And it's so hard, with books and pieces of something on paper, you can rewrite it as many times as you want with no real financial implication other than it might take you a few more weeks or months. But with a movie, getting everybody out there again is quite financially burdensome unless you've planned to do it from the beginning. So so that opening was part of our continued thoughts in our second draft.
Right. And Daniel, what did you think about? David's sitting right here, so I don't expect stinging criticism here. But what did you think about some of the decisions they made that did flesh those things out in terms of the backstory, and also, it's funny because most of the time you get you have, let's say, a 450-page novel, and somebody kind of boils it down and everyone talks about what's missing. But you kind of had this very spare, as you said, that was your vision of it. It's kind of like a notebook from one person's perspective. It's scary and it's quick. And I wonder if you felt like it was almost like a longer novel in a way, the movie, because there were these new things to react to.
Yeah, the movie, that's a good point. The movie had to be more like a novel than my book. I didn't even call it in English because the publishing house wanted it. We called it a novel. When I published it in the original in German, we didn't even call it a novel. We didn't give it any genre.
I think I called it a novella in my review. I didn't want to let you get away with that.
Yeah, no, it is a novella. It is a novella, but we felt like for such a strange book, it's kind of cooler to not have any kind of genre on it. But of course, that's what it is. It is a novella. It's a little bit too long for a short story. So novella is I think the right term. And the film has to be more like a novel than the book. And I did have other offers to turn it into movies from they would have explored the other way to go with this, to make it into a very slow, beautiful, surreal art house type of movie. And that is, of course, a very interesting way to go. And it's also the director who wanted to do that. He said to me, it's not going to be very scary, but it's going to be really beautiful and strange and something unusual. And then, of course, I had this offer from David to do it with Kevin Bacon. And it was clear from the beginning, this would be like the real thing. This would be a real horror movie, than with that following the rules of the genre. Like, you really need to scare people. And there's something, there's of course the backstory, but there's also the fact in the book, I don't really have any, you can't have jump scares in the book. It just doesn't work. If there is a way to make that work, I haven't found it. So in a horror movie that you want to aim at the people who do watch horror movies and are interested in that, you actually have to throw stuff at them. You have to scare them. And I was really curious to see how people who really know their craft would make that happen. And so it was very clear to me it would be more like they would have to flesh out a lot of things that are kind of left unsaid and that are just left as gaps in the book. And it was fascinating to see that.
David, in terms of throwing things at people and scaring them, you have a very varied CV of movies that you've both written and directed. You've written more than you've directed, but I wonder, how you decide which projects you're drawn to direct in particular, and whether it has anything to do with wanting to try out some other trick or other kind of approach to getting viewers' attention, whether it's the jump scares or the structure of the story, or does that not really play into it as much?
No, that does. I've tried to mix it up a lot. I've tried to, as you're supposed to do at the gym, I've tried to exercise my directing muscle to the point of failure. And I think I have reached that point several times. And I'm always trying to do something where I feel like I maybe can't do it, and that it's going to be a spectacular failure. And I've had one or two of those, and then I vow, well, okay, so don't go that way again. The thing about a scary movie, there's been this sort of horror renaissance in the last 10 years, as major Hollywood studios have moved further and further into the gigantic blockbuster business, as they're more and more vertically integrated, owned by gigantic corporations. It's much harder to get made, say, a movie like The Paper that you referred to, that was only 20 years ago, 25 years ago. But what they have embraced, they love the very high and the very low. So clearly they love a $300 million superhero movie, or they love something that's under 10 million and in a clearly identifiable genre, and they will make those. And one of the things that they've discovered about horror is that filmmakers can sneak in other kinds of movies with a horror movie if you follow certain genre demands, like you got to scare us every once in a while. They'll let you get away with telling a marital drama in that, or like get out a movie about race relations. You can, and this isn't new, it's more popular in the last 10 years, but back in the 1950s, famously, with Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and It Came from Outer Space, there were a lot of movies about the fear of communism, fifth columnists in our country, that the most effective ones came through in the science fiction horror genre. And they were popular too. So you can make a movie that might be more interesting to filmmakers or actors, and it's interesting to an audience as well, by combining that.
A quick reminder that if you want to ask any questions of Daniel or David, that you can leave them in the chat at the bottom of the screen, where we'll see them, and I'll be able to ask them a little later on. Also, just a reminder to buy books from McNally Jackson. Daniel's in particular. David is an author himself. In addition to screenwriter and director, it wasn't enough for him to dominate Hollywood. He's made his move in the literary world as well. And McNally Jackson, just in general, is a jewel in New York, in its various locations. So, and the reason we're not there, unfortunately, in doing this in front of people, is because, of course, of the pandemic. And so I'm curious, David, you were just talking about the model in terms of what studios are willing to do and not do right now. But from both of you, on David's side, I'm curious about how your work and the sort of world of your work has changed in the last few months, and when you see it changing back, if ever, fully. And Daniel, you have Tyll, your latest novel, which came out earlier this year. And I hate to say that it feels a lot longer ago than that, just because these last few months have been so strange. But it just came out in February, and it's going to be a Netflix series. So I'm curious to hear an update from you about where that is in production and what we can expect there.
Yeah, I think I can start because I can give a very short answer. Then David can talk about this very interesting question you asked him. It's going to be a Netflix show, and it's I talked to the producers, who's Baran Bo-Odar and his wife and writing partner, Antje Friese, and they are going to do it. And I just agreed that I will try to write it. And so that's a big challenge. And it's, of course, means moving into a field I have zero experience in. So I'm kind of even hesitant.
Oh my God. The whole thing? You're going to write 8 hours or the
Yeah, I'm gonna write 6 hours. Yeah. So yeah,
Ah,
I know. I know.
good
Uh,
deal.
so it's, but I mean, I know the story, so I hope that's gonna help. But yeah, yeah,
I'm
that's
sure you have David's phone number if you ever want some advice.
yeah. I might ask for some advice.
Run into some barrier.
That can happen.
But David, how about you and about obviously the distribution of this movie, the way that it's coming out, the timing of it, and also just in general, the other projects you've been working on or the people you know are working on. What does the landscape look like right now to you?
Well, first about this one, it's been really fascinating. I mean, it's fascinating, you know, if you do what I do for a living, but I think also for people who like movies. So we finished this movie in February, and we were in the middle of the conversations about, okay, where and how are we going to come out? Is there a spot in the theatrical release calendar where we won't get crushed by the great, you know, giant behemoths that stalk the multiplexes? Should we go directly to streaming? If so, what's the best streaming venue? How do you do that? And then COVID hit and everything shut down in March. And within a few weeks, Jason Blum, the producer, and I started talking to each other and saying that, and Universal was leading the way on this. This can't be the end of watching new movies. Of course, we all want movies in movie theaters, and we can't wait to get back to movie theaters. But Universal started working with this idea, maybe new movies should come out on Fridays, and you know, we can have the premium video on demand as another way to watch movies. And they caught some guff. They started with Invisible Man and then Trolls, which I think is a lot of the same audience as this movie. They did very, very well with them. And the theater owners got very upset, and there's been a lot of bickering between Universal's kind of taking the high road. Theater owners are upset because they feel it's an existential threat. I don't think it is. Going to the movies is very different from watching a movie at home, and you can love and treasure both experiences. What I really love about it is last weekend, there were two notable openings, Spike Lee's movie To Five Bloods and King of Staten Island. Both came out on Friday. So in the week leading up to it, I read about them a lot online. I said, oh, great. I made plans to watch them both over the weekend. I talked to my friends about them on Monday to see what they thought. And it was really lovely. It was sort of the return of communal movie going, even though we weren't all in the same room together. We were having the same experience at the same time. And, you know, reviewers and journalists who I liked and read regularly were writing about them at the same time, so they could tell me what I thought, and I could parrot them as my own thoughts. You know, the stuff that that was a joke, but they're very hard to play on Zoom. So I find it to be a really exciting time, and I think it's sort of an ideal situation for this movie, which, you know, kind of coincidentally is about people who can't get out of the house. So I think there's certainly we didn't plan those parallels, but you know, I think it might be a movie that you enjoy even more on your couch at, you know, now than you would.
Yeah, it's a great on your couch movie. And for fans of Invisible Man, which I watched early on in quarantine, you know, that unlike Trolls, this is really almost a shot-for-shot remake of Trolls in a way, but The Invisible Man is definitely in the same genre. And we do have a couple of questions in the chat. The chat has been activated. Chris D, and this is a good excuse for me to use a quote I found earlier. Chris D says, I'd love to ask David if one of his previous films, Secret Window, was an inspiration for him to take on this project, as the story shares some similarities, it seems to me. And that's funny because I saw an interview you did about that movie, David, and during it you said, I guess I just really am drawn to guy in a house going crazy movies.
Still, I can't stop, and I won't stop. Someone will have to make me stop. I don't know. I've been doing it now for like 25 years. I love some, you know, there's a very obvious, the story and its metaphor can exist at the exact same time. The house has levels and, you know, corners and dark places that you have that are not explored and might scare you. And your character has levels and corners and dark places to explore. It really, they really go together very well. They
and you made at least there was an adjacent movie that I think John mentioned in his intro, Panic Room, which was also terrific.
Oh, thanks. That,
which
yeah,
has some,
with a lot of help from David Fincher, but yeah. I was complaining about this to Brian De Palma and I have stayed friends for over the years, and we did a few movies together a while ago. And I was writing something, and I said, "Oh, it's another, seemingly normal guy has something weird happen to him in his house movie." And he said, "Yeah, it's called Who You Are. Stop worrying about it. There's nothing you can do about it."
Richard Kaminsky in the chat says, and this will be for Daniel, I think, initially, if there's an answer to give. In the run-up to this conversation and the film release, I've seen some people discuss the similarities to House of Leaves in both the novel and the film. I'd love to hear some thoughts on how those play off of one another. And I assume he's talking about the Mark Danielewski experimental novel, which I unfortunately haven't read. But if either of you is familiar with it and do think there are any echoes, speak now or forever hold your peace.
I read some of it. It's a very, very long, very messy novel with very, very strong moments. And I wouldn't say it was a big influence. That idea about a place where geometry doesn't work anymore. The biggest influence for me on that idea was Algernon Blackwood's wonderful novella, The Willows, which Borges loved. So, and Borges, it was also Borges' idea to have a place where geometry doesn't work anymore. Like Borges, with Borges, it's often an object, like a book that has that has it has more pages than anyone can possibly count, like the Book of Sand. And in Blackwood, it's an island where somehow geometry doesn't work anymore. And I have kind of a Blackwoodish explanation that there are multiple universes. It's the multiverse theory, and at some places the fabric of ours goes thin, and another universe comes close, and that's why geometry is kind of not reliable anymore, and neither is time. And I think I saw some of that discussion about House of Leaves, which is because it's because in the trailer there is a measurement scene. Someone, the main character, Theo, he's measuring the inside of the house towards the outside of the house. So that was not in my novella. I love that idea. I don't know in how many places you can find it. But that was not an idea I used, but I loved it in the movie. And I think it's people who saw the trailer and it's like it happens on the internet, then get very excited about something that is just a fragment of the whole thing in the movie, and they haven't even seen the movie and are discussing that. And also they don't find it helpful to actually read the book when they're discussing that. So that's
No, the measuring scene is mine. I was thinking more of there's an episode of The Twilight Zone, one of the best ones, like many of the best ones, written by Richard Matheson. An episode called Little Girl Lost, which sort of famously became a bit of an inspiration for Poltergeist. And in it, there's a couple in bed at night, and they say goodnight to their little girl. They go to bed, and then they hear her cry out, calling for them in the night. They go into her room, and she's not there, but they can still hear her voice. And they start measuring. They start looking for her. They look under the bed. They look everywhere. They search the whole house. They can't find her, but they still hear her voice. They find that if they move her bed aside and they go over to her wall and they like chalk off a portion of the wall where they can actually reach through it. Somehow another dimension has opened up in that house. So they call their friend, the physicist, at 2 a.m, as one does. And he comes running over in a trench coat suited to a physicist. And he starts laying out, what he thinks is going on, which is that this other dimension's opened up, and then they got to tie a rope to Dad, and he goes in and tries to get her back, or maybe it's Mom, I don't remember. anyway, Little Girl Lost, and like much of Matheson's work, did influence me in a, very positive and contributive way, I thought. I did read much of House of Leaves when it came out, and I remember it to an extent, but I think a house where the rules of reality no longer apply is not quite exactly new. I think there's been a lot of that. No offense, Daniel. I mean, I love it, but I think we riffed on an idea that has been in the popular imagination for the hundreds of years.
Yeah, it goes at least back to Escher.
Yeah.
So here's another question from Kevin Martos in the chat, which is, and I'm gonna do a follow-up of my own with a different budget. He says, I'd like to ask David which movie he would like to make or book to adapt if a production company put a blank check to do whatever he wanted. And then I would say, I'd also be curious about what you would like to do that had a very, very constrained budget and where you didn't have a lot of resources, but you could.
Well, I wouldn't take their money because that's a trick. You see, they'll give you the big budget. I mean, the biggest budget I ever worked on was, as a director, was about $60 million, which by Hollywood standards is not much. But it was the worst movie I ever made, and it was also the worst personal experience because people who, not surprisingly, people who give you tens of millions of dollars are very interested in getting it back. So the check may be blank, but that doesn't mean there's no strings attached. And they have a lot of opinions about how it ought to go. So what I would do is I would say, no, keep a whole bunch of your money. Give me this smaller amount of your money. I'd like to, although I wouldn't want to spend a year and a half doing this, it's a thought exercise, but I'd like to remake I Am Legend, the Richard Matheson novel, which has been made into a movie 4 times and never used his beautiful ending from the novel. It's the best ending to a horror novel I've ever read, including Stoker, and it's just they've never done it. 4 times that movie's come up to the plate and whiffed the ending, and they end up, they don't work. And the ending of the book is fabulous. It's worth buying his book and reading it just to get to the last paragraph. So I'd love to remake that, but I'd do it for about 8.
That's an offer. So if in the chat you've got 8 million and you want to remake I Am Legend,
and you happen to own the rights to I Am Legend,
right,
yeah.
Right, which is probably a hurdle. Well, this has been great fun. Daniel, I want to thank you especially again because I know that it's late there. You have a child. You're staying up into the wee hours. David, thank you also. It's great to meet you. Big fan of both of your work, so support these guys. Watch this movie, buy their books, and this was a real pleasure. And just thanks everyone for joining us during this really strange time. It's always nice to be able to do something fun and interesting from these remote locations we find ourselves in. So thanks again, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Nice to see you, Daniel.
Nice to see you. Thank you so much for doing this, John, and thank you to McNally. And yeah, this was great.
Thanks, Dan. Take care, guys.
Have a good night.
Bye.